I began researching this story under a title other than the one I've chosen for this video. Alfred and Elizabeth Startle the World was going to be called An Idea Whose Time Has Come, because that's what I believe to be true. The idea in question is that of intelligent design theory. This says that the natural world shows clear evidence of being designed and is not just the result of random, purposeless, naturalistic forces. Instinctively, this feels correct, and not just for me. For as long as there have been observers on Earth, it's been thought that the universe is designed rather than just being a mere pointless accident. This view includes Greek philosophers, as well as some of the architects of modern science. Galileo, for example, the Italian astronomer, physicist and engineer. Johannes Kepler, the German astronomer and mathematician. And Isaac Newton, the English mathematician and physicist and astronomer, and probably the most influential scientist of his day. Also, Michael Faraday, the specialist in electromagnetism and electrochemistry. And Louis Pasteur, the French biologist and microbiologist. And even Albert Einstein, quoted here. Anyone who becomes seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that there's a spirit manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man. It's primarily because of Charles Darwin that the idea of a self-organizing, randomly created universe became the dominant explanation adopted in the West, although even Darwin acknowledged that the world looks to be designed, even when he believes it is not. Quote, "One cannot look at this universe with all living productions and man without believing that all has been intelligently designed," he wrote in 1861, before then rejecting the idea. While Darwin's evolutionary theory has become integral to Western culture and tends to be regarded as fact rather than theory, intelligent design supporters are posing an increasingly formidable challenge to Darwinian assumptions. Intelligent design theory argues that life and the universe cannot be explained by blind processes, and it provides empirical evidence for this view. And it also appeals to no religious authority for its conclusions, despite what its critics claim. So why have I chosen these two people, Alfred and Elizabeth, to startle the world? Firstly, I'd like you to meet Alfred Russel Wallace, shown here. Although he was the co-discoverer with Darwin of the theory of natural selection, he arrived at his views independently from Darwin. His paper on the subject was first presented in 1858 to the Linnean Society at Burlington House in London's Mayfair. It was given jointly with Charles Darwin's first paper on the same topic. So what do we know about this man? Wallace was a British naturalist and explorer, geographer, anthropologist and biologist who undertook extensive fieldwork abroad, firstly in the Amazon River basin and later in the Malay archipelago. He was considered the 19th century's leading expert on geographical distribution of animal species. However, he later developed the notion that the higher mental faculties of humans had a non-material origin. And over the years, his distrust in Darwin's theory as it related to mankind specifically, subsequently strained his relationship both with Darwin and with members of the scientific establishment. Unlike many of his scientific contemporaries, Wallace had financial difficulties throughout his life. His field trips to the Amazon and the Far East were financed only by selling the various specimens that he collected. Mostly, though, he supported himself through his publications. He wrote 22 full-length books and over 740 shorter pieces, including 508 scientific papers. Darwin, by contrast, had family wealth to fall back on, as shown by this sumptuous home which lay 15 miles south of London in the Kent countryside. Wallace even had difficulty finding paid employment, such as being a museum curator, for which he was very well qualified. So he received no regular income until he was awarded a small government pension in 1881. His death in 1913, at the age of 90, received wide press coverage, since he'd been a leading scientist for decades. In 1866, he was president of the anthropology section of the British Association. In 1870, he became president of the Entomological Society of London. In 1876, he became head of the biology section of the British Association. And in 1893, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, based here in London. Even a crater on the Moon, shown here, and this 173-kilometre wide crater on the planet Mars, shown here, are named after Alfred Russel Wallace, as are a group of Indonesian islands, shown here, and as well as several hundred species of plants and animals. So he's not a man to be underestimated. On the 100th anniversary of his death in 2013, his statue was presented to the Natural History Museum in London. And yet there was one area of his life that scientists did not approve of: his acceptance of the evidence of spiritualism, and also its implications for Darwin's pet theory. It's not well known that numerous scientists in the 19th century were open to the psychical and spiritualist phenomena that Wallace found influenced him and helped him explain his divergence from Darwin regarding the origin of man. He became convinced that natural selection was insufficient in itself to explain man's origins, and he proposed that higher intelligences were guiding humanity's development in definite directions for special ends. However, surrounded as he was by disapproval for these ideas from 1869, when he first announced his doubts about the sufficiency of natural selection, Wallace felt forced to exclude his spiritual perspective from the discussion. That is, until 2 decades later. Initially, he based his criticisms on other criteria that seemed both quaint and not very impressive by modern-day standards. Wallace claimed that the human mind, his consciousness, intellectual and moral nature, had shielded his body from the action of natural selection over time, despite its powerfully influencing all other species. It was the power of his mind, Wallace claimed, that put an end to further human structural development. By means of the intellect, he argued, man could survive in the world with an unchanged body. He gave the example of climate change requiring animals to develop layers of fat or thicker fur when weather got colder, whereas humans could adapt quickly by using clothes to keep warm, obviating the need for the body itself to adapt. He saw the use of fire and cooking as a way of making food more available, while other species would either adapt slowly or fail to grow their populations in challenging situations. He also saw the use of weapons as a means to augment human food supplies. So the intellect had undermined the relevance of Darwin's survival of the fittest as far as mankind was concerned. For Wallace, the structure of man's bodies had remained constant through the ages, while animal species had continued to evolve. With Darwin's concern that Wallace's new ideas might undermine his evolutionary theory, Darwin wrote to Wallace, quote, "I hope you have not murdered too completely your own and my child." Darwin believed that when new biological structures developed in a species, they would not be retained if they failed to benefit the species' survival. Nor would they be preserved simply because they might turn out to be valuable to future generations. So here was a source of disagreement between these two men. For Wallace, the evolution of consciousness and man's moral nature were inexplicable as mere products of natural selection. He argued that 1. The large brain size of prehistoric man was in advance of their needs. 2. That this also applied to the sophisticated structure and articulation of the hand. In addition, 3. This applied to the organs of speech. And 4. It applied to the human physical form. All these attributes, he said, were developed in advance of early man's current needs, but they were kept anyway. Yet once developed and kept, these characteristics did provide for future use in modern man. Therefore, Wallace argued, they could not have been developed in line with natural selection alone. But if natural selection failed to explain mankind's physical traits, what was the alternative? Wallace asserted that higher intelligences guided the laws of organic development. So here we see Wallace as just about the first advocate of modern intelligent design theory outside of the tenets of traditional religions. Darwin's response was incredulous. Quote, "I differ grievously from you, and I am very sorry for it. I can see no necessity for calling in an additional cause in regard to man." But Wallace was not swayed by this opinion, nor by the barrage of criticism that declared, "This is not science." Indeed, he rather enjoyed the controversy, making clear that intelligence other than God could have been active agents. One must remember, though, that Wallace had not given up on natural selection for other species, only in the case of man. Nonetheless, in 1869, Wallace informed Darwin that his new views were solely the result of his acceptance of spiritualism. Until the last few decades, the intelligent design movement hardly developed. But in the United States, the Discovery Institute has become a major advocate of ID, and a company called Illustra Media is responsible for making excellent intelligent design movies. Here's a snippet from one of their trailers. You can find their documentaries, Unlocking the Mystery of Life and The Privileged Planet, on YouTube, and there are many other Illustra movie trailers too. Of course, the latest evidence supporting intelligent design is far in advance of Wallace's rather antiquated and some would say incorrect notions. What biology tells us today was simply not available to Darwin or Wallace back then. Take, for example, the interior of the cell. Since World War II, microbiologists have discovered that each living cell is incredibly complex, and it's a far cry from Darwin's simple blob of protoplasm. Too small for the eye to see, every cell contains an array of differentiated biochemical functions controlled by complex information. Each human body contains between 30 and 50 trillion cells. That is to say, this huge number, 50 with 12 zeros after it, with over 200 specialized cell types, such as muscle tissue, blood cells, liver and kidney cells, bone cells, nerves, brain cells, glands, skin cells, and many more. Each cell is protected by a membrane that regulates nutrients in and waste products out. So the question arises, was that membrane envelope created before the contents of the cell developed, or afterwards, or simultaneously? And if so, how come? There are hints of design here, since one part of the cell cannot survive without the other part. A bit like the chicken and egg. Which came first? The cell's DNA nucleus contains tiny channels through which information-carrying chemicals pass to regulate functions. The rest of the cell, the cytoplasm, contains tiny organelles responsible for the cell's functioning, with mitochondria providing its energy needs. Within this labyrinth, fats and proteins are synthesized, and proteins made up of huge chains of amino acids in a specific order are fundamental to all the cell's processes, allowing these proteins to fold into particular shape in order to perform a particular job within the cell. It's a marvel of miniaturized biochemical engineering beyond anything man himself could design. And the amazing thing is that we humans each produce 50 to 70 billion new cells every day to replace defunct ones. If Darwin were alive today, he would be gobsmacked at the sheer depth and breadth of what microbiologists have revealed. Later in his life, Alfred Russel Wallace went public about being influenced by spiritualism, and he became a full member of the spiritualist movement. Here is his membership card. If you leave out the spiritual nature of man, you are not studying man at all, he declared. And here is his statement of belief from a leading newspaper. Quote, "Nothing in evolution can account for the soul of man. The difference between man and the other animals is unbridgeable. I hold that there was a subsequent act of creation giving to man, when he emerged from his ape-like ancestry, a spirit or soul." And in a letter to Darwin, Wallace wrote, "My opinions on the subject have been modified solely by the consideration of a series of remarkable phenomena, physical and mental, I have now had every opportunity of fully testing, and which demonstrate the existence of forces and influence not yet recognized by science." A few years later, Sir William Crookes, the renowned British chemist and inventor, would be agreeing with him. Much later, Wallace wrote to a friend, quote, "I know that non-human intelligences exist, that there are minds disconnected from the physical body, and that there is therefore a spiritual world. This is not for me a belief merely, but knowledge founded on the long-continued observation of facts." But his attempts to persuade other scientists of his viewpoint by inviting them to attend seances with him failed utterly. And this is where we introduce the other character in my title. How did Elizabeth startle the world? Well, Elizabeth Guppy was of fundamental importance for Wallace's spiritualistic insights, since he tested her mediumistic abilities thoroughly over several months. But she was not the first person to provide him with evidence. This came from Britain's first professional medium, Mrs Mary Marshall. He experienced table levitation in defiance of gravity, the communication of names, ages, and other particulars of the relatives of those present at the séance, presumably unknown to the medium. And when the letters of the alphabet were voiced and raps were sounded at the correct letters, they spelled out the name and place of death of one of Wallace's brothers, and the name of the last mutual friend to visit his brother. Of course, being aware of the possibility of deception, Wallace performed tests to rule it out. He checked tables before a séance to assure himself that they were just ordinary furniture. He placed them wherever he pleased prior to the séance. He also secretly marked blank paper to ensure it was not exchanged for another piece with a name pre-written on it. He also read the spiritualist literature extensively. It was his sister who introduced him to a medium, a Miss Nicol, also known as Miss White, who became Mrs Elizabeth Guppy on her marriage to Mr Samuel Guppy, a wealthy gentleman. Through Miss Nicol, Wallace experienced raps, table tilting and levitation, and also the production of musical sounds, and most remarkably, the production of masses of fruit and flowers as apports into the séance room. These flowers were so copious that Wallace preserved them and attached to them the attestation of all present that they had no share in bringing the flowers into the room. Very diffuse light made the table visible, so any outsider depositing them secretly would have been seen, but none was. Wallace wrote a short description in the December 1866 edition of Spiritual magazine. In all, there were 15 chrysanthemums, 6 variegated anemones, 4 tulips, 5 orange-berried solanums, 6 ferns of 2 different kinds, with 9 flowers, 37 stalks in all. The freshness, coldness and dewiness of the flowers precluded the possibility that they'd been brought into the room by any member of the party, since over an hour had passed in a warm room before the flowers were produced. Wallace continued to test Miss Nicol from late 1866 until mid-1867, and became convinced of the reality of her phenomena. Later, Mrs Guppy became the first medium in England to produce spirit materializations, and in 1877, Wallace witnessed a full materialization in daylight with the medium Mr Monk. The materialized figure separated from the medium to a distance of 6 feet before being slowly reabsorbed. Wallace was convinced that no fraud occurred, but many of his peers dismissed séance phenomena as a priori impossible, something Wallace refused to do. He was a high-minded, ethical individual, and very much impressed with the sheer diversity in nature. He thought this diversity was only intelligible in terms of the action of a purposeful mind guiding organic development. Since his biological work demonstrated his undoubted observational skills, his disbelieving evolutionist peers were baffled by his acceptance of such psychical phenomena. For Wallace, the enormous influence of ideas, principles and beliefs in man's life could not be explained just in terms of the struggle for survival. And Wallace pointed out how difficult it was to explain the rapid increase in human brain size over time by relying solely on natural selection's accumulation of slight favourable variables. The Society for Psychical Research was founded in 1882, and Wallace was an early member. Approached by Sir William Barrett, one of the founders, to make himself available for the SPR presidency, he rejected the offer, fearing that his image as a crank would injure the Society's reputation, not that he was ashamed of his spiritualist beliefs. So, returning to this video's title, the startling that Alfred Russel Wallace did was his startling of the scientific establishment through his rejection of pure materialism. How did Elizabeth Guppy startle the world? The answer to this is a sensational and actually rather humorous incident that occurred long after Wallace completed his investigations with Miss Nicol. According to the legend, at 10 p.m. on the 3rd of June 1871, with 10 distinguished and flabbergasted signatories to confirm it, Elizabeth Guppy was reluctantly teleported from her London home in Highbury to a séance taking place 3 miles away. Allegedly, she was sitting with her companion, Miss Nayland, doing the household accounts at her bureau, whilst her friend reminded her of items to include in them. As Miss Nayland was mentioning onions, she became aware that Mrs Guppy had been silent, so on looking up she found that she'd actually vanished. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in Holborn, 2 young psychic mediums, Frank Hearn and Charles Williams, were holding a séance. The 10 sitters included academics, industrialists, and the editor of the Spiritualist magazine, a man called William Henry Harrison. The cramped room above the shop was locked and in the dark when Frank Hearn and Charles Williams began to channel the spirits of John King and his daughter Katie, speaking through the mediums. Apparently, addressing the spirit of Katie King, William Harrison joked, "Why don't you bring Mrs Guppy to us?" To which another sitter replied, "Good gracious, I hope not. She's one of the biggest women in London." She was indeed a large lady, some said 17 stones, which is to say 108 kilos. Nervous laughter followed, but Katie agreed to do it. I will, I will, I will," she cried. The voice of her father then called out, "You can't do it, Katie." Yet after a 3-minute silence, and with a loud thump, something heavy landed on the table. When a match was struck, it revealed the bewildered Mrs Guppy standing in the middle of the table, barefoot, and dressed only in her dressing gown. She was clutching her pen in one hand and her ledger in the other, in which she was writing the word onions, with the ink reputedly still wet on the page. Witnesses reported that she stood there trembling, burst into tears, and gave an emotional account to the stunned audience that the last thing she could remember was sitting at home doing up her household accounts. She said that whilst writing, she became insensible, awoke in a dark place, and heard voices, and she thought she was dead. On recognising the voices around her, she was greatly relieved, but she complained of having no shoes or bonnet to go home in, and she was not dressed for a visit. At one point, a light was struck during the séance, and Frank Hearn was seen by 4 persons levitating in the air with his feet above the level of the table and his arms held up to the ceiling. Then his whole body fell back into his chair. He said that he'd spoken to Miss Nayland in the billiard room at Mrs Guppy's house, but the billiard table had been replaced by another piece of furniture. Mrs Guppy confirmed that her husband had removed the billiard table to another part of the house that very morning. Now, to check the veracity of this incident, Mrs Guppy and 4 witnesses travelled in 2 cabs back to her home at Highbury, where Miss Nayland was spoken to privately to prevent any collusion between her employer and herself. She said that she and Mrs Guppy were sitting on opposite sides of the fireplace when she disappeared. The only unusual thing she noticed was a haze on the ceiling and a rapping noise on the desk that she associated with spirit activity. Having discovered Mrs Guppy missing, she searched the house without a trace of her anywhere. So she reported this to Mr Guppy at his billiard table. When told of her disappearance, he joked, "No doubt the spirits have carried her off, but they'll take care of her," and he continued with his game. For several days after this ordeal, Mrs Guppy was reported to be very tired, weak and unwell, but in conclusion, all of the séance guests signed a statement to the effect that they had witnessed this remarkable event in a locked room with no fraud whatsoever involved. Not surprisingly, this startling teleportation became a miracle of the age. Spiritualists claimed it demonstrated the power of spirits. Others thought it an elaborate publicity stunt without being able to suggest actually how it was done. If it was trickery, it would have required a conspiracy among all the parties, which seemed unlikely. Now, to critics, the signatories were at best gullible and at worst complicit in fraud, which brings us to this book by Molly Whittington Egan. Mrs Guppy Takes a Flight, a modern assessment of this odd piece of psychical history. In it, the author dissects the life of Mrs Guppy on the basis that she's a conwoman and not a medium at all. She asserts that Mrs Guppy was only ever a relentless cheat and trickster. Where the evidence is slight, the book relies heavily on assuming, presuming and probabilities in order to substantiate its negativity. And it also contains a great deal of detailed genealogical material that's irrelevant to the story, but seemingly included as filler, or because the research had already been done, so it must be used. This book highlights the author's disdain for Mrs Guppy and all mediums, so perhaps it's not surprising to find denigration such as this on page 21. Quote, "Whatever the origins of the ludicrous connection between Alfred Russel Wallace and Mrs Guppy," she says, "we cannot wish it away." She claims that Wallace was duped through and through. And furthermore, she says that Alfred Russel Wallace, solemnly identifying the species of the flowers in her imports, was what she calls, quote, "a vain attempt by Wallace to validate the phenomena." So much for the handicap of the author not being there over 100 years later. And yet the material for a more balanced appraisal is also included in the book, even though its importance is ignored. For example, the author points out that Mrs Guppy was never caught in fraud by anyone. So how does the author know it was fraud through and through? And having condemned Mrs Guppy's voluminous apports of flowers at her séances as being simply items that she hid under her dress to get them into the room, we also find that on page 75, when newly married Mrs Guppy was giving a séance to the aristocracy in Naples one evening, with Princess L'Alquila and Countess Castellana present, doubts were expressed by a Madame Val d'Or that Mrs Guppy might have concealed apports about her person. So Mrs Guppy insisted on undressing and donning a dressing gown belonging to the Duchess, with a shawl to keep her warm. They then took her to a different room, and yet the flower apports still came. And this occurred when the medium's husband was elsewhere for the evening and could not have been a co-conspirator. So where does all that leave the author's claim that she was an inveterate cheat? And in her chapter entitled "The Medium Abroad," there are several other examples of what seem to me like genuine psychical phenomena. For example, this statement was sent to the London Dialectical Society by a Mr. Trollope, quote, "With regard to the sitting with Mrs Guppy, I can only say that with the greatest watchfulness, those taking part failed to detect any trace of imposture. The physical phenomena, such as the sudden falling onto the table of a large quantity of jonquils, which filled the whole room with their odour, was extraordinary." And Mr Guppy commented, "On lighting the candles, the whole of Mrs Guppy's and Mr Trollope's hands and arms were covered with jonquil flowers. The smell was quite overpowering. The doors were locked, the windows fastened. Had a bunch of jonquils been in the room before the séance, it would have been detected by the smell." Or take this case. The British ambassador, Sir Arthur Paget, put on a séance at which they held Mrs Guppy's hands and then asked for a noise. There was a loud concussion on the wall, like a gun. It seems to me that the author's intention is to belittle Mrs Guppy at every opportunity. The claim that Mrs Guppy was jealous of other mediums and out to attack them relies only on hearsay and rumour. Even if it was true, did it necessarily invalidate her mediumship? I don't think so. You can tell that I found this to be a cynical biography and found it difficult to accept the author's view that all psychical phenomena are rubbish. The author criticises Mrs Guppy for, when she was unmarried, lying about her undistinguished family background. But even today, this is the daily fare on Facebook. Inflated claims to give a good impression may have been as standard then as they are today. Until she married Mr Guppy, Miss Nicol also covered up her true relationship with an older man, a society sculptor. It may have been shocking back then, but it's hardly so today. And interestingly, Mrs Guppy's teleportation is not alone in the psychical literature. On the 19th of May 1871, months before Mrs Guppy's teleportation, the medium Frank Hearn announced that in mid-morning he had a strange sick sensation and lost consciousness. After some minutes he found himself in Mrs Guppy's house, 2 miles away. Molly Whittington Egan presumes this to have been a rehearsal for Mrs Guppy's later performance, and she presumes that the two mediums, Hearn and Williams, were being trained by Mrs Guppy to cheat. If you have watched my YouTube video on the Brazilian medium Carlos Mirabelli, you'll be familiar with this scene of a Brazilian train station. In 1926, Mirabelli was about to board a train from São Paulo to the port of Santos with friends, when one of his companions claimed that he simply vanished into thin air on the platform, fading in a foggy haze as if erased from existence, and all in the middle of the day in front of dozens of witnesses. But things got stranger when, 15 minutes later, They had a phone call from Mirabelli himself. He claimed that he'd suddenly appeared in the town of San Vicente, 56 miles away, near the train's destination of Santos. On regaining his bearings, only 2 minutes had elapsed, and he'd been transported there practically instantaneously. On another occasion, he dematerialised from a séance room while still tied to his chair, with the doors and windows sealed. He travelled to another room in the same building, and some of the sitters remained in the séance room while others went searching for him. And on finding him, the seals on his bonds were still untouched. Elsewhere in the literature is the case of Alec Harris in the 1960s, a Welsh materialisation medium. Without knowing how it occurred, he found himself taken from the upstairs séance room of his home to the front garden of his house. His arrival was witnessed by his circle, who left the séance room before him to come downstairs, but he arrived there before them, knocking at the door to be let in. Another instance occurred 2 years after Mrs Guppy's case in 1873. 9 signatories wrote to the Daily Telegraph reporting the teleportation of someone called, quote, a sceptical gentleman who wished to remain anonymous. He's now known to have been a Mr Henderson, a photographer, attending a Guppy séance. After Mrs Guppy wished for someone to disappear from the locked room, he was taken in an instant 1.5 miles to the home of a Mr and Mrs Stokes, who had been talking about him over dinner. The case was rigorously investigated, with many witnesses confirming it was genuine. Another curious case occurred on the evening of March the 16th, 1878, at a séance in Grosvenor Square, London. Gathered together were 2 mediums, Arthur Coleman and J.W. Fletcher, with 4 sitters, including the medium William Eglinton, and the same newspaper editor as in the Guppy case, Mr. William Harrison. The doors were allegedly closed and locked, leaving the room in darkness. And at one point, Mr. Harrison called out for the spirits to take someone up through the ceiling as proof of their power. And at this point, Eglinton disappeared. The whole group had been holding hands, and the one holding the missing man's hands gasped in astonishment when he seemed to just fade away into nothing. Immediately afterwards, a loud thump was heard directly upstairs. With the lights back on, it was discovered that Eglinton was no longer in the séance room, although the door in the room was still locked. When the upper floors were searched, he was found sprawled across the floor in a deep trance. He woke up minutes later, complaining about his head as if it had been struck from behind. As it happens, Alfred Russel Wallace once witnessed materialisations with Eglinton and was convinced that they were genuine. He saw a phantom created while Eglinton was visible and sitting in an armchair. A careful search was made, but no fraudulent paraphernalia were found on that occasion. So was Alfred Russel Wallace, one of the most remarkable scientists of the 19th century, as ludicrous as Molly Whittington Egan alleges? I think not. The good news is that these stories, entertaining as they are, do not actually impinge on the deeper issue of intelligent design, in which Wallace was a forerunner in the modern ID movement. Before we leave Wallace, though, I found this interesting quotation of his, which emphasises the distance created between himself and Darwin. Quote, "The gulf which separates the ant from Isaac Newton, the ape from William Shakespeare, and the parrot from Isaiah cannot be bridged by the struggle for existence. It was on this very point that I differed from Darwin, and it is on these points that I cannot meet the modern materialists who say that man is merely an animal and there's nothing for him beyond the grave." For a more detailed appraisal of this issue, I recommend a paper entitled Alfred Russel Wallace and the Origin of Man and Spiritualism. It's by Malcolm J. Kotler, and it's available on the internet. Now, I cannot summarise the evidence of intelligent design theory within the scope of a short documentary, but I can recommend the books that have influenced me. Michael Denton is an Australian molecular biologist and medical doctor who published 2 books 20 years apart. In 1996 he wrote Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, which impressed me very much, the first such book I read, and he followed it up in 2016 with Evolution, Still a Theory in Crisis. A major contributor to this field is Dr. Stephen Mayer, the author of 2 important books. In 1910 he published The Signature in the Cell, and in 2015 he authored Darwin's Doubt. There are also significant books by Professor Michael Behe, including Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution, which became pretty much of a bestseller, and also his book The Edge of Evolution, The Search for the Limits of Darwinism. And there are a couple of very readable books from Geoffrey Simmons, MD. What Darwin Didn't Know, A Doctor Dissects the Theory of Evolution, and his later publication, Billions of Missing Links, a rational look at the mysteries evolution cannot explain. Now, if I've interested you in this topic, you might even like my short 2016 YouTube documentary aimed at young people that's also suitable for adults. It has the cheeky title, Darwin Bulls. Despite acceptance of neo-Darwinian theory in the West, almost to the point of its being regarded as fact, I think that intelligent design will continue to make inroads into how we think life has developed on this planet. To quote the Harvard astrophysicist Professor Dr. Avi Loeb, he says, "We should keep an open mind and not presume we know the answer in advance." Thanks for listening.